Chapter 7. Like the End of the World. Zechariah. The Lord God has always had dealings with humans, of course, ever since the world began. But Abraham was the first to whom he swore an oath. He gave him his son Isaac, and afterwards he swore to bless him and to multiply his descendants until there were as many of them as stars in the sky or grains of sand on the seashore. He promised, moreover, that through these descendants every nation on earth would be blessed. So Abraham lived and died, as did his son Isaac after him, as did his son Jacob, whose other name was Israel. By that name all our people are named, although we are also called the children of Abraham, or the Jews, or simply the people of God. I'd always liked to rehearse the names, squeezing all that history into those few familiar words: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Samuel, David, Solomon. Since my meeting with the angel, I could not speak, and I had to write them instead of saying them, but it was still a comfort. All those generations, and the Lord God had remained the same. But my thoughts in those days kept dragging themselves back to one name in particular: Elijah. In the spirit and power of Elijah, the angel had said in the temple as he spoke about my unborn son, he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. So my pen scratched the name again and again, pressing down so hard you'd have been able to read what I'd written even if I hadn't used ink. Elijah, 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 carved into the parchment like an etching on stone. What you must understand is that after King David, things went downhill for our people. God had promised that one of David's descendants would sit on the throne forever and ever, that his kingdom would never end. But the kings who came after David did not live up to his example. They did not love God as he had. They did not lead the people as God's king should. The worst king of all was Ahab, and it was to him that Elijah came. Elijah, 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 I wrote, my hands starting to shake with the effort. The spirit and power of Elijah. What did that mean? Elijah's was a story I had told many times to the boys in the synagogue. During the reign of Ahab, I used to say there was a terrible famine, a time when no garden was green and even the best vineyard could not thrive. The dust gathered in the crevices of the eyes, and the belly ached, and the throat croaked for water. No rains came, and no crops grew, and there was not enough to eat, and all this was because of the wickedness of King Ahab and his wife. Queen Jezebel was not a child of Abraham, I'd explain, and she did not love the Lord. She turned her husband away from the God who had given him his kingdom. The two of them worshipped the false god Baal instead, and they taught all the people to do the same. So law became lawlessness, order became chaos, and where there should have been peace, there was violence. And then I tell the story of Elijah. He came to warn the king. He came with a message from God himself, but Ahab did not listen, and this was why the famine was so severe. At last, I'd tell the boys quietly, meeting their eyes one by one to check they were listening, and they always were. There was a gathering of all the people. Elijah stood before them and told them to make up their minds. If the Lord is God, he cried out, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But they did not answer. They would not say who they would follow. I'd pause for a few heartbeats here, dropping my gaze, hoping that the boys would be asking themselves the question, what would I have said? And that their answer would be, the Lord. Then I'd go on. So Elijah held a contest there on the mountaintop. They all agreed the way it would work. It was simple. There would be 2 piles of wood, and the God who was truly God would be the one to send fire and set the wood ablaze. The priests of Baal danced and shouted, I'd say, raising my arms and twirling my fingers a little. They begged and prayed, they cut themselves with swords and spears to get their God's attention, but Baal made no answer. No fire came. Then Elijah had men bring great jars and drench his own pile of wood with water so that no one could set it alight. They poured the water once, twice, 3 times. The people watched. They had still not decided which God they would follow. Elijah said, Lord, Let it be known that you are God in Israel." He prayed, "Answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then, like a sigh or a whisper or a sudden breeze, the fire fell. Have you ever seen a tree falling? A tree that had seemed to be strong. At first there's a soft creak, nothing to disturb you. Then comes the almighty groan and crash that sends birds spinning into the air and causes the little creatures of the earth to quake in their burrows. That's how I imagine it was when the fire fell on the mountain, as if the world was ending. "So," I'd say in a whisper, "the people said, 'The Lord, He is God,' and determined to worship only Him. And after that the first cloud appeared on the horizon, and the rain began to fall. Then I'd clap my hands suddenly, and all the boys would jump in shock. They were always so absorbed in the story, and I'd laugh and send them outside to play." "The spirit and power of Elijah," I wrote again now. "My son, the child who was growing day by day in my dear Elizabeth's womb, would be like this man. It was God who sent the fire, but Elijah was the man He used. He was the way God turned the hearts of His people back to Himself." In our day, there were some who were looking for a new king. They longed to see a David on the throne of Israel again. They desired independence and freedom. Joseph's brother Josiah, as I was to learn, was one of those. But the truth was that God had not just promised to send a king. He had not just promised to send wise leaders or great warriors or even mighty angels like the one who came to me in the temple. He had promised to come Himself, the Lord God Almighty, walking among us. It would be unimaginable. It would be like the end of the world. And He had said, hundreds of years ago He had said, that before that day came, He would send someone ahead of Him, someone to prepare the way, and that someone would be like Elijah. And the angel said to me about my son, he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So this is what I was asking myself as I carved those words into the parchment harder and harder. If my son was to be like Elijah, then who was coming next? And would he bring joy or terror